According to data, ports are vital nodes of global connectivity. They serve as entry and exit points for global trade. Ports often serve as checkpoints for the movement of people and goods. They are interfaces between land territories and maritime spaces, which symbolize the meeting between cultures and economies, but also the challenges linked to national security and border regulation. Welcome to the Borders in Globalization podcast. Welcome to our listeners. I'm speaking from the traditional territory of the Lekwungen peoples in the Salish Sea region. Today, we are going to talk about borders and ports of the future with Alan Bersin. Alan Bersin has worked in several US government positions on the subject of borders. He has been working as attorney and he is a legal advisor in an American multinational law firm. He is also executive chairman at Altana AI, a big data artificial intelligence platform. It's great to see you, Alan. Welcome on board.
Thank you, Benjamin. It's always a pleasure to talk borders with you. And I'm looking forward to this discussion on what will borders and ports of entry to those borders look like in the coming generation.
Thank you, Alan. So today we are going to talk about new port ecosystems, maritime flows, land flows, air flows, and their effects on the object and theory of borders. My first question, Alan, is general. The ports of the future play a crucial role in the fluidity and efficiency of the global logistics chain, facilitating the transport of goods across continents. How do the ports of the future contribute to the global supply chain, and how are these contributions likely to change in the future, Alan?
So as you indicated, the global supply chain requires ports of entry to make it work. This is the exchange of cargo in trade and people in mobility as tourists, migrants, students, and in many, several other capacities. The question is, how do you get in and out of a particular political jurisdiction, depending on the regulations that govern that particular port of entry? Let me provide some headlines, because in fact, we're in for some major changes in the way that ports of entry operate. We're in the midst, generally, today in a huge era of transition in virtually every dimension of economic, political, and social life. And so it's not surprising that trade and the handling of trade and travel is subject to those changes and will ultimately reflect them. So what are the headlines? The first is that for the last generation, we've had a international trade and mobility environment dictated by counterterrorism resulting from the events of 9/11. That event changed the way in which governments and the private sector and private citizens looked at transnational movement in a fundamental way that has shaped the way ports of entry have been built and operated in the last 23 years. So that's the first point. Counterterrorism is no longer the cornerstone mission of border management, which it has been over the last generation. The second major development and change that's ongoing in this space is that the first phase of globalization, which began in the early 1990s with the North American Free Trade Agreement in North America in 1994, the admission of China into the World Trade Organization about the same time, led to a vast expansion in global trade, a expansion that was largely mediated and determined by the private sector, that was focused on low cost production and immediate availability, which had dramatic effects, as we'll explore, in the logistics operation of the world. But in fact, that phase of globalization came to an end roughly coincident with the pandemic. The idea that working capital optimization, low cost, immediate availability were the only major factors that shaped the way in which people and governments viewed trade and had an impact on ports of entry. The new missions confronting border management, in addition to the legacy missions of counterterrorism and counter-transnational crime, are basically revolving around compliance challenges growing out of the new world order that's emerging. This new world order, the ending of the post-World War II order, basically involves two central trends. First, there's a splintering of the international order and the reemergence of traditional geopolitical rivalries, obvious with Russia and in the pivot of China away from the West and vice versa. And the second is the emergence of a new globalization involving, at least in the West, an agenda that is no longer centered solely on counterterrorism and counter narcotics, for example, but rather involves environmental conservation, enhanced protection and concern with human rights. And all of this took place again over time, but came to visibility during the pandemic. And as a result of those two trends, the splintering of the world order and the new demands of regulators with regard to the so-called ESG agenda, we saw a massive disarray in global supply chains, starting with personal protective equipment, but actually through the pandemic and even today results in dislocations and inefficiencies that have to be confronted. As a result of these changes, regulatory compliance by the trading community becomes a central mission of border management. Whether this involves Chinese tariffs, Russian sanctions, modern slavery, enforced labor markets, or carbon imprints, together with the public health concerns stemming from the pandemic, these are the new concerns that drive regulators and therefore importers and exporters. And these have effects on mobility of people across borders, particularly as we saw during the pandemic from the public health concerns arising from the COVID-19 pandemic. And on top of all of this, we should not minimize the continued troublemaking of non-state actors, such as terrorist groups like Hamas and transnational organized crime, now killing more than 100,000 Americans through fentanyl. So the legacy concerns remain, but we have a new agenda to actually work through in international trade. So where does that leave us? Ports of the future have to be redesigned to meet the current challenges. We've built in the West, led by the US and the EU, but now fully evident in the Persian Arabian Gulf or in the Far East, very advanced border management enterprises over the last generation. But it's been overtaken. This enterprise has been overtaken by events and cannot yet handle the new challenges at the border. So this is the challenge. We need to move from a largely counter-terrorist environment and regulatory scene to one that is broader and more complex, even than what we faced a generation ago. So, what are the ports of the what are the new elements that are involved in dealing with these trade compliance? The first, I think, is the notion that we will rely even more than ever before on data. Starting with 9/11, nations around the world developed very sophisticated targeting and screening regimes in accordance with a risk management approach to the entry and exit of cargo and people from jurisdictions. They're developed multilaterally an approach to this that really was focused on looking for bombs in boxes in the counterterrorist sense, or narcotics in a freight shipment or on a person traveling through an airport. We developed a way of dealing with this that involved advance information. That is, before cargoes entered ports of entry or people entered seaports, land ports, and airports, there was an exchange of information between the government regulatory authority and the individual traveler or the particular exporter and importer involved. And there developed over the last generation a capacity to assess risk and to segment traffic so that you could achieve the twin aims of both security, but also trade and traveler mobility and facilitation. And those remain the objectives, but as I said, in a different environment with different challenges. And how ports of entry deal with this will be on the agenda of border managers and regulatory authorities worldwide intensely over the next number of years. So, what are the key policy elements that are involved in this? The first is that we have to recognize that this will be a system that requires extraordinary partnership in two basic respects. One is between the government as it reasserts its authority, its sovereign authority over the control of people and goods into its jurisdiction, and also a new requirement for international cooperation, collaboration in ways that we have seen. There was progress during the post 9/11 era on terrorism, but the kind of cooperation that will be required here is extraordinarily different and more intensive if, in fact, we are to work toward the ports of the future and the trade and travel future that seems to be on the horizon. So what was the data arrangements in the last generation, the ones that currently dominate ports of entry around the world? There is a natural reluctance to share data, a refusal to share information for what have been traditionally good reasons: concerns over sovereignty, national security, concerns over proprietary data in the private sector. Competitors have not wanted to share with competing companies. And then privacy concerns, individuals being hesitant to share information with the government. And this lack of information sharing, even among close allies and friends, was a big obstacle to the regime that was needed to be put in place to have advance information so that travelers and cargo could be assessed and then segmented according to the level of risk they presented. We eventually worked through these issues with a system of what became known as federated search. So governments, companies, and individuals did not want to share their data, but they provided access to others for the purpose of operating the risk management regime, so that people traveling in airports, when a passenger presented herself or himself to a airport counter, their PNR, their personal data, would be sent to a variety of agencies who had provided the agreement to to participate in a federated search, which means that companies, governments did not share the data, but they permitted the access so that that particular traveler's name could be pinged against the database, and any risk associated with that traveler identified and communicated back to the requesting party. And that's also the way it worked with cargo. Federated searches, cargo being pinged against a variety of databases, the databases themselves not being shared, but the system functioned and has functioned and functions today in a reasonably satisfactory manner to facilitating lawful trade and travel within the constraints of security. But we're in a different period now. That period of federated search was limited, but it did serve when we gave up the notion of global data marts. Nobody wanted to put their information in a crate and give it to another party and receive that other party's data likewise. But the federated search, as I said, worked well. But in today's environment, and in the ports of the future, what's going to be required is a vast exchange of information and a much more complete and immediate exchange of information that would simply overwhelm the federated search system. What we have to do in order to clear and secure trade and travel is we have to arrange an exchange of data in ways that we have not yet seen. And this ties into the partnership that I indicated. The other major change going forward is the partnership between the government and the private sector and between and among government regulators themselves. What is envisioned for the port of the future is really a seamless movement of goods with a real-time assessment of risk and the segmentation of that traffic in ways that permit trade and travel to flow very evenly and very securely around the world. The way to do this, before getting into how this would get done, Benjamin, let me describe why information technology today has permitted us to go beyond the problems we experienced with data sharing and information sharing in the past through the development of new analytic techniques such as federated learning. Federated learning starts from the proposition that all companies and governments now maintain their data sets in containerized clouds. And they are stovepiped in ways that they have always been, but never available to anyone else. Information technologists have developed this technique of federated learning that permits the sharing of data signal without the commingling of data. That is to say that the search engine can actually extract from each of these stovepipe data sets risk signal that can be shared among all of the participants in the arrangement. We can, if you have any questions on how this works in a hub and spoke fashion, is something we can come back to. But the great value, the premium value here is that governments, competitors, people can share data without actually commingling the data. They can share the signal, the substance of risk contained in that data in ways that permit things that we have not before seen. So, for example, we will see in the handling of cargo something that has been focused on in the counter-terrorist age, but was never achieved, which was a genuine 100% scanning of cargo. That is to say, cargo would be scanned by non-intrusive machines or by personal inspection by border officials in ways that were dictated by risk. But we obviously, at this stage, are not in a position to look at every cargo, except we can scan based on risk assessment cargo with new technologies that would permit us a level of security and also an assurance that this particular cargo or person did not present a risk to entry. And this federated learning will involve the and then the 100% scanning that comes out of that will permit companies to share all of their supply chain data in a protected fashion. It will permit governments to share information and to do it in a way that does not involve, as I said, the commingling of data. What it will then facilitate is the creation of trusted networks, so that as a result of a private sector willingness to share its data, there will be the rights of rapid movement through ports of entry. This all will involve advanced information, and the 100% scanning will be done long before a cargo arrives at a seaport or an airport or a land border port, which presents its own difficulties. But the concept is trusted networks rather than simply trusted traders that will facilitate the movement of those cargoes that are part of the trusted network. Now, the trusted network will involve not only private sector and governments, which was the way in which trusted trader programs of the past, AEO programs, have operated, but rather a larger network of trusted ports around the world where governments will accept the scanning of cargo containers, and using a library of images that would be developed and shared by these governments, will be able to make a very rapid risk assessment about the dangers that might be presented by that container. For those who participate in the trusted network, that scanning will be done at its own fact long before it enters the stream of commerce. And then with various corridor security features, there will be a rapid movement through to the destination port, pre-cleared in ways that expand on current pre-clearance programs dramatically. So let me pause there. I've put a lot on the table about what the new environment looks like. It will not be. This is something that will take as the post 9/11 regime took. It will start evolving. It's evolving now, but this is a 7 to 10 year development with the trusted network and the various new techniques being implemented gradually, starting in, I think, regions like the EU and North America, but then extending throughout the West. And depending on the splintering of the world order, there will have to be separately negotiated agreements between the West and China, and between the West and the still developing world.
Thanks, Alan, for this technical summary of all the trends about ports of the future and globalization of goods and persons across the globe. I have now a legal question for you, Alan. With international borders, we know that flows must both be able to legally cross the borders, and the managers of the flows should know how to manage the legal differences between countries. And with these legal differences, for example, between the EU, European Union, and the US, how is it possible to manage the different laws and jurisdictions in terms of data management or data protection? Do you have some insight to share with us, please, Alan?
So harmonization of regulatory regimes will continue to be a challenge, but with the federated learning techniques and the agreements between countries and between the private sector, we will see a new paradigm emerge that will in part address, Benjamin, the question you raised. The new paradigm will be one in which the burden of proof and persuasion will be on the private sector to demonstrate compliance with a variety of regulatory demands of governments, and they will be different in the EU and North America and China, for example. But the burden will be on the private sector to satisfy each of those regulatory authorities, and to do so through the means that I mentioned before, by the sharing of data in a protected fashion that can address the variety of concerns and comply with the different privacy and data protection demands of different jurisdictions. But the paradigm will be, there will be a rebuttable presumption. So looking at the trusted network, there will be a rebuttable presumption that every cargo that is sent and every person that travels and intends to cross borders will actually be presumed to need inspection, to require an inspection. Much of that will take place in the data analysis that takes place before the person arrives at the airport or before a cargo arrives at the port. And that burden on the traveler and on the private sector entity will be the way in which these regimes develop in the future. So, for example, in the cargo area, we see in the United States a regulatory requirement in the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act that says that anything coming from a particular region of China, Xinjiang, is presumed to involve forced labor that will prevent that cargo from being entered into the United States. The burden is on the importer to demonstrate either that the cargo is outside the scope of the UFLPA, the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act, or that forced labor was not utilized in the production and of the particular product involved. If that burden is met, then entry is permitted. And I think we're going to be looking at this along the entire range of regulatory requirements in the future, where the private sector will have the burden of demonstrating compliance with the various demands, and that the government, in exchange for that, the reciprocal requirement of the government is that it's much more transparent about the differences that you indicated and the kinds of information that it will require for importers and exporters to bring product and shipments across the border, or for people to enter into a jurisdiction. I think that's the way in which this will work, through this partnership with the private sector, but a shift in the regulatory burden of persuasion.
Thank you, Alan. As we saw throughout this interview, smart ports of the future integrate advanced technologies to optimize operations, improve efficiency, and provide superior services. These ports play also an essential role in stimulating regional economic activity. If we think now at the regional level around this port of entries, how do the smart ports of the future help stimulate innovation and regional economic growth? Do you have some concrete example of ports of entry with this economical dynamism? Do you have some illustrations for us, please, Alan?
Yeah. So you raised two issues. One is the in this globalization 2.0 that's emerging. What is the role of region in that? And then the second is what are the kinds of examples that we have internationally of ports that are moving steadily toward this vision of future ports that we've been discussing. So, with regard to the latter, I think we've seen great progress in ports around the world in terms of expediting the movement of cargo in an efficient way. We see that at the Tuas port in Singapore. We see that at the ports of entry and exit in the Arabian Gulf, in Abu Dhabi and Dubai. We see it in the EU in Rotterdam as a good example, and in North America, I think we are seeing U.S. Customs and Border Protection moving with steady progress toward this new vision that marries the goals of security, compliance, and rapid movement. Those would be the examples I would cite, although there are others. With regard to the first question that touches on this new era of globalization that's emerging, there are some like Shannon O'Neill who argue that most of globalization 1.0, notwithstanding the great growth in the volumes of international trade, was actually regionally based, whether in East Asia or in the EU or in North America. And I think that's partially true. The reason that I think it will even be more evident in this emerging globalization 2.0 that we are living in the midst of now is the splintered world order. Global trade is not going away, to be sure, but in fact, you're seeing the kinds of nearshoring and allied shoring and friend shoring that permits the private sector to meet regulatory requirements in the West, particularly. But you're seeing this focus on regional trade, and this is going to be important because I think you will see the most immediate development of ports of the future, consistent with the vision that we've been discussing, will actually take place on a regional basis to begin with, so that the EU is a natural place, given the integration that's occurred, to really work through all of this, both with regard to internal EU movement, which is largely now given way to dealing with coming in from outside the EU, but it will require a considerable enhancement, in my view, of the EU's perimeter security and perimeter compliance checks, and I think that will be the focus. In North America, the way forward is very clear. To develop the trusted network and the trusted international relationships that would permit the kind of seamless movement, you will see even greater progress than's been made over the last generation in coordination among Mexican, Canadian, and U.S. port authorities and regulators, so that the port of the future will emerge first on a regional basis, but then you will see its growth and evolution involve more and more of those who are willing to participate in a new framework of regulatory requirements and to participate in the partnerships, both on the public-private side and on the international side that I've mentioned.
Thank you, Alan. Before the end of our interview, I have a question related to the environmental sustainability. We know that the development of, for example, the maritime flows can cause serious dangers to the global marine ecosystem. Environmental sustainability has become a major priority for ports of the future, facing challenges such as reducing emissions, managing waste, and preserving marine ecosystems. What are the main challenges, Alan, that the ports are facing in terms of environmental protection, global transnational environmental protection, and how are these challenges being addressed in your technology or in your new paradigm shift?
Yeah. So the logistics business is in the midst of change, as everyone else involved in international trade is. And the first requirement is to actually cut down on your own carbon imprint, right? So you need to develop ways of transport that don't involve the kind of energy sources that have been traditionally used in the past. And as we know, not only in the logistics and trade context, this is a challenge for the next half century, and one that we have begun very incipiently to see progress in terms of alternative energy sources. But that's the first area where you will have to see massive change, and it is taking place in terms of some of the large shipping lines like Maersk, but much more needs to be done there. The second dimension is to be able to assess the carbon imprint of the cargo that's being transported into your jurisdiction. And that will figure into the data exchanges that we've discussed previously. But we haven't even begun to develop the conceptual framework, or we're at the very beginning of doing so, that would permit a steady exchange of information that would permit governments to regulate the entry of products into their jurisdictions based on the extent to which they do or do not do harm to the environment in the production process. Again, this is an element that will become more and more important, and as it does, it will generate the resources and the research that's going to be required to provide the information. And then, lastly, it's a question of will governments have the will to cooperate here in ways that really will be required. It's one thing for the EU and the United States to have a different requirement, to have similar requirements on forced labor or modern slavery. It's a far different matter to get regulators to agree on what is an acceptable environmental impact and what is not. And there, we haven't even begun to explore ways in which we can reach a reconciliation of regulatory regimes on environmental impact. So, no question that this is a direction in which we're moving, Benjamin, but it is not going to take place quickly. Other elements of the Port of the Future will precede it, and hopefully the kinds of data and signal risk sharing mechanisms that will be in place will enhance and facilitate the ability to address these much more complicated issues of regulation.
Thank you very much, Alan. it's soon the end of our interview, but before letting you go, Alan, last question, but not least, I would like we could speak a bit about the transformation of border studies and the importance of ports of entries in order to understand a new field of research inside border studies. So several authors think that borders are a complex juridical phenomenon with multiple legal dimensions. Example, a line, a delimitation, or a filter, a system of control, but also a link between two states who are neighbors to each other. Also an area, a zone of cooperation, etc. And with our discussion, we could notice that borders are becoming some kind of various validation mechanisms. So my question is this one, Alan. What are the effects of this globalization 2.0 about over all these seaports, airports, or land ports, and their regulation in the field of border studies? I mean, how is the topic of ports of entry and of this new technology relevant and important for border studies and the next generations of border students? What could we learn finally, Alan?
Yeah, but where shall we look to start solving the challenges that we face in implementing the ports of the future? There will be many, and there will be many opportunities for researchers, academic, and policy thinkers to think these through, to take the paradigm changes that I've indicated we're in the midst of living through, but to actually give a shape and an understanding to this in ways that need to be done if we're to see the practical changes that are required. But we've seen border study researchers and thinkers do this before. In the last generation, we moved away from thinking, as you suggest, of borders as lines dividing nations, where everything needed to be checked at a borderline, to understanding in the global context, we're dealing with flows of goods, people, in addition to ideas, labor, capital. All of these things are moving in the modern world. And in order to regulate them properly and expedite their movement, we need to enlist time and space so that we're dealing with these issues not at the borderline, but well in advance. And our discussion today has indicated some future directions for that. Border study experts will be sorely in need to help explain these. But in addition to the conceptual issues, there are a whole array of operational issues that need to be developed in dealing with the ports of the future. So, for example, there are two dimensions of infrastructure. There's bricks and mortar, the way in which ports are built, and they will have to change to reflect new ways of doing business. And the second is an invisible infrastructure of regulatory procedures and the data that's necessary to comply with a variety of different legal and juridical requirements coming from around the world. Those two types of infrastructure that need to be changed need to be studied, and they need to be implemented in ways that, as I say, marry the goals of compliance, security, and facilitation. The concept here is to manage the trade-offs between security, compliance, and between compliance and facilitation in a way that permits this ultimate seamless reconciliation, so that we can identify high risk and deal with it, and we can facilitate a low and moderate risk movement in much faster fashion. And then we should, before ending, note that so much of the world now has become a matter of e-commerce. of business to consumer direct shipments, so that we actually have the emergence of a entirely new port of entry in mail depots, right? So that mail depots that have been traditionally handled by customs authorities are going to have to be reshaped in order to handle not only the volumes, but the types of problems. And de minimis customs requirements do not preclude and should not preclude the gathering of the substantial direct data about what is contained in those small packages and parcels. That's an issue that is, I think, central on many regulators' minds and desks. But it's something I wanted to point out. And then, of course, given the importance of advanced data and federated learning to the new regime and the new vision, cybersecurity, which we haven't touched on, becomes a central concern, and one that needs to be dealt with, so that we do not have a trusted network that is penetrable by hostile or outside disturbing forces. So, there's a lot of work to be done. I think on airports, because of the contained environment, we've made the greatest progress. But even there in airports, Benjamin, we're going to be looking to a seamless movement where you're only checked once. And much of that's done in advance. And then with facial recognition, as soon as you enter the airport, then enter the security places, you are identified biometrically. That would permit you to move pretty seamlessly through to your airplane. We're closer to that, to the port of the future in air travel, again, because it's a contained environment. We're furthest away from it. And then I should say also with regard to air cargo movement, we have systems in place that involve the kind of partnership between express carriers, the private sector, and governments that will be improved, but are already in existence. Land border ports present the biggest challenge, although just recently, Customs and Border Protection in the United States is taking the biometric facial recognition technology that's been so useful in airports and is now experimenting on using it with privately occupied vehicles crossing a land border. That will be a big advance, and I think is certainly within reach. The second is a problem to be confronted both in the EU and in North America as elsewhere, is dealing with the long queues of cargo trucks that wait at border lines to move. We're going to need to use all of the advanced information and federated learning techniques and pre-arrival inspections to facilitate the movement through green lanes of those in the trusted network whose cargoes should not be slowed up, but rather moved expeditiously through the port of entry, which demonstrates an important lesson. People often talk about the need to balance security and trade facilitation and passenger mobility. I think as we move toward the ports of the future, we'll see a convergence such that the process by which we screen and assess risk on people and cargo will more and more become a situation where both of the elements are part of that process. And we will not see this dichotomy that exists today conceptually and practically between security and facilitation, but rather the process itself will enhance both security and facilitation at scale for people and cargo. And then I should just say seaports, which carry most of the cargo, will see the greatest change in the shortest period. Land border ports will take more time to move to this vision, but seaports, I think, are the next candidate, where we have not only the information technology and the cooperation among governments, but rather a movement of cargo when it gets to the port in ways that will expedite the movement of lawful container traffic, for example.
Thank you very much, Alan, for this conversation about the ports of the future, about borders and ports of entries, with the different spectrum of these ports. We have also learned new concepts as federated learnings, trusted networks, signals, risk sharing. I think it's very important for the next studies about borders. And I will let the audience with this last reflection and the last question. Are flows becoming the new borders in globalization 2.0? Thank you very much, Alan. It was a very great conversation.
As always, Benjamin, a pleasure.
This was the Borders in Globalization podcast. Thank you for your attention and see you soon for the next issue. Bye-bye.